Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first time fiction panel. My name is Kristyn Dorfman. I'm a librarian at Friends Academy in New York, and I'll be moderating the session. We're going to jump right into it. I'm so excited to welcome Tolani Akinola with her debut, Leave Your Mess at Home, from Pamela Dorman Books. Heather Ang with her book, Double Happiness by Tiny Reparation Books. Juliet Faithfull and her book Liar's Dice by through Random House. Rebecca Lehmann with her book The Beheading Game by Crown, and Erin L. McCoy with her debut Underlake from Doubleday. So welcome everyone. So happy to see you. This first question is for everyone. It's a simple one, an easy, well, not simple, but a quick one. Please give a 30-second elevator pitch of your book. And we're going to start with Tolani.
Hi everyone, happy to be here. Leave Your Mess at Home follows four Nigerian American siblings during a single autumn in their native Chicago. And basically, their eldest estranged sister returns to the city for the first time in years, which causes each of the siblings to then have to examine why their family is so dysfunctional. And then a Thanksgiving dinner brings the whole family together for the first time in a decade, and it becomes a very deeply chaotic affair which then leads each of the siblings to excavate the past and begin to examine also, the ways in which they've learned to love and failed to learn to love. And thus leave your mess at home.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Next, we have Heather.
Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here too. So, my novel is Double Happiness, and it's the story of Mei Lee, a 36-year-old late bloomer from working class Queens, New York, who finally has it all until right before her wedding, an unexpected new love interest makes her rethink her hard-won love, life, and career choices. Readers have called Double Happiness a smart girl weekend read and a beach read with depth, which was exactly what I was going for. Because even though Double Happiness is a sunny, fast-paced read with a love triangle, warm sibling relationships, and immersive armchair travel to Hawaii and the Hudson Valley, it also tackles timely topics like financial insecurity, social striving, toxic work, and mental health.
Thank you, Heather. Um, Next, we have Juliet. Juliet, the mute button.
Sorry. Hello, everyone. Liar's Dice is set in 1970s Brazil during the military dictatorship. And it's the story of a young girl, an identical twin, Dolores, and her very strong, inseparable tie to her twin sister, Mita. They run around in rural Brazil inseparable until Mita comes down with a serious illness. And she gets worse progressively year by year. One day, Dolores wakes up and finds her sister gone, sent off to an institution. And the novel is really Dolores's desperate effort to get her sister back.
Thank you so much, Juliet. Next, we have Rebecca.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. My novel is called The Beheading Game, and it is a speculative historical fiction novel about Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was executed on false charges of incest, adultery, and treason in 1536. She was Henry VIII's second of six wives. And the novel begins the night of her execution. She wakes up beheaded, but still somehow alive in her casket, escapes from the Tower of London with her head under her arm, sews her head back on, and then goes on a 10-day revenge quest to find and kill Henry VIII before he can marry his next wife, Jane Seymour, and produce a rival heir to the throne so that Anne Boleyn's own daughter, Elizabeth, who in real life became Queen Elizabeth I, the famous Renaissance queen with the big ruff and the red hair, can immediately ascend to the throne. It takes a lot of liberties and has a little bit of magic, but is also very much a historical novel with a lot of deep research into the Tudor time period.
Thank you so much. And then we have Erin.
I am so excited to be here. This is a fantastic panel with a lot of incredible books. Underlake tells the story of two women who were raised worlds apart and who must now join forces in search of a missing girl. Ada is a failed marine biologist carrying the guilt of a friend's disappearance during a deep sea dive. And May is a stranger who shows up at her door, claiming that her daughter has run away and insisting that she's under the nearby lake alive. To find May's daughter, Ada and May have to travel deeper and deeper under that lake. The novel explores the extremes of delusion and suffering to which institutional religion, white flight, and nostalgia have driven some parts of the United States.
Thank you, everyone. Those were amazing. I was like, I read these and I'm like, I want to read them. We're going to jump in and we're going to start with Rebecca. So, one of the things I noticed was that the beheading game also has a lot of other stories within the main story. They gave a lot of insight to the characters, the time period, parallels to her own circumstances. So, what influenced you to include these vignettes, and which are, I think, some are from your own imagination, though I might not be true, and some are from the era. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thank you so much for noticing that. So, across the span of the beheading game, there are allusions to different stories going on, like Gawain and the Green Knight, for example. But then there are three fairy tales or folk tales that are told at kind of anchoring points in the novel. The first one is a story called Mr. Fox, which is a contemporary story from Tudor times. And it's the English folktale version of Bluebeard, which of course is the story about the woman that marries the man, and then the fairy tale. And then he's like, you can go anywhere in the house, but not that one room. And when she opens the door, of course, she finds all of his previous wives dead and murdered in the room. So Mr. Fox is a very similar tale, except in that story, the young woman finds out that Mr. Fox is a Bluebeard figure before the wedding, and her male relatives intercede and like chop him up into little bits and pieces. And it shows up in the beheading game toward the front end of the novel. The beheading game, as I said, has this like revenge plot, but it is also a story that is really interested in unpacking what happened to Anne Boleyn and how she was accused of these things that most historians today agree she did not do, and why she was executed. And so she's kind of thinking back on her life and piecing together this long courtship that she had with Henry VIII before she married him, a 7-year courtship before he could get an annulment from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and marry her. And then this like 3-year marriage that was very tumultuous. So she thinks about the story of Mr. Fox when she's crossing onto London Bridge and sees as was the custom of the time, the heads of the 5 men who were executed as being her accused lovers on London Bridge. And one of those heads is the head of her own brother. And it of course, is very upsetting to her. And she thinks about George, her brother, telling her this story, Mr. Fox, when they were kids. And it's a moment in the novel when she really thinks about her own marriage in the context of the Mr. Fox or Bluebeard story. I think Henry VIII is a classic Bluebeard figure. He has 6 wives. He has 2 of them murdered by the state, in my opinion, murdered by the state, executed for crimes that they may or may not have committed. And he just sort of burns through women trying to get what he wants, which is a male heir. The second fairy tale in the book, or folk tale, is The Golden Bird. And it's a story that Anne encounters around the middle of the novel. She has had this sort of winding path traveling under the guise of a commoner, and she's made friends with a part-time prostitute named Alice, who doesn't know who she is. She's lied to Alice and told her that she's someone else. And they've been traveling together, and they end up in the northern part of England in the fens, and Alice's children are there, and they've been cared for by this childminder. And this childminder tells the story of the Golden Bird, which is this kind of twisty fairy tale. It's a Grimm Brothers tale that I've adapted slightly for the novel, but it involves a character that comes back to life like Anne has, and it also involves a beheading partway through the fairy tale. And that is the moment in the novel when Anne really kind of comes face to face with the fact that she has been beheaded and brought back to life. Because once she sews her head back on, she can kind of live in denial that like she is who she is and she has died and been resurrected. And she kind of gets into this lie that she's telling that she's someone else. And then the final fairy tale is one that I made up, and it's one that Anne tells at the end of the novel. And I don't want to give that away because it really relates to the ending of the novel, but she has to make a really hard decision at the end of the novel. And the fairy tale that she tells it's her way of processing that decision and kind of explaining it to herself and the person that she's talking to. I think that for me, the decision to include these fairy tales kind of came from my own personal life because I have young children. And so I'm really involved in the world of fairy tale and folk tale. And I also think that fairy tales and folk tales are sometimes how, like when we're little, how we make sense of the world around us. And even as we age, stories are the way that we make sense of what's happening in the world around us. So I wanted to bring those in and have Anne just sort of like interact with these stories of her time, kind of like a pilgrim on the Canterbury Tales would have, like just encountering these stories in the world around her.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Yeah, it was interesting to see how they wove together and merged it with Anne's story. Um, my next question is for Tolani. In Leave Your Mess at Home, each Longe sibling struggles with whether they are enough for themselves, their family, their cultural heritage. They have their own struggles and crisis, which comes to a head at the climax of the book, which I feel like is like so appropriate for this time of year. It was just Thanksgiving recently. So could you speak about your process weaving these multiple threads of identity and belonging into each family relationship?
Definitely. And I would say that the process was iterative for sure. Like, revision is definitely the novelist's best friend. When I first started the novel, I was really focused on, okay, well, first of all, I'd originally intended to write a story about unrequited love, and each of the siblings then like hijacked my brain. And so it's kind of like I ended up following these four disparate threads of people who were really fascinating and were dealing with a lot of the themes that you just mentioned. The not enoughness, the feelings of cultural alienation as second generation Nigerians, and also the pressure to succeed, search for belonging. And they kind of all read like people who had these interesting conflicts, but were living very disparate lives. And so the weaving together then was something that occurred over many drafts and over a lot of time as the family revealed itself to me, and I could understand the factions that existed within this family dynamic and, what really was at the core of everything that went wrong.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My next question is for Erin in Underlake. We are introduced to a town submerged underwater. How did you come up with the idea for Underlake and the different people and communities that inhabit it?
Yeah, thanks for that question. The novel began with that image. I just a house submerged, and the idea that this house in isolation might construct its own version of the world entirely distinct from what anyone else might experience, that kind of isolation can breed extremes. So that image led to a chain of houses. Each of them were worlds unto themselves, and not unlike how many of us live here, these little sort of sealed up palaces that we create for ourselves, these isolated homes. It definitely connected for me. That image was where I began, but it connected for me to a story that I'd heard in middle school about a rural lake nearby that had an entire town under it. And these are not uncommon. There's actually hundreds of these all around the US, towns under lakes and hundreds, if not thousands more all around the world. They're constructed to make way for flood remediation projects or hydroelectric projects and all sorts of reasons. So that was definitely a seed for the book. For me, each of the isolated communities, how they actually the characteristics of each bubbled up through the process of writing. So it was important for me that each of them was culturally, economically, politically a product of their particular environment, not just the depths that they were at under the lake, but also the people that they were with. So I wanted to explore how we're a product of our environments and that how we can be blind to everything outside that environment, and explore all the million ways we can and people that we can become because of where we are, who we are, with whom we are, and when we are living.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was very fascinating to see those different iterations. So the next question is for Heather. May goes through major transformation and growth in Double Happiness. She's dealing with complicated romantic relationships, traumatic family history, an unfulfilling career. How do you balance these in your writing?
So, the question at the heart of double happiness is what makes a happy life? And even though double happiness is a love story, we all know that happiness isn't just about finding the right partner. Happiness is also having a meaningful career. For my character, May, happiness is earning enough money so she's not constantly worried about it. And happiness is also your friends and family, not just what you've inherited from your family, but the joy you get from your loved ones. And May's close relationship with her little sister Allie is a huge part of double happiness. In fact, my novel was inspired by a long running inside joke I had with my little sister, which is what if we, as two sisters, ended up with two brothers? That never happened for us, but it happens in double happiness. So while I was writing, I thought about those three elements that you mentioned: love, work, and family. And I thought about weaving them into a French braid. And as I wrote, I layered in more context and backstory about each one to create a braided narrative that shows you who May is and the challenges she's facing as she figures out what a happy life looks like for her.
Thank you. And I love that description of the braiding. And then we have Juliet. Liar's Dice looks at expectations we have for ourselves and for the people in our lives. Dolores is struggling with guilt about her twin, Mita, but also with the failings of the adults around her. In what ways do Dolores's expectations of those around her impact the story? The sound. Thank you.
Not used to this. Dolores expected her parents to continue to love and care for her sister. She expected her family to remain intact, that you come to the world as a family. You don't just pull one member out and send them away. So she feels very betrayed by her parents' decision to institutionalize her sister. And she feels angry that they didn't consult with her, they didn't tell her. It happens from one day to the other. And then when they move to Rio, she sees her parents sort of involved in giving dinner parties, getting ahead, and they never talk about Margarita. There are no photographs of her. So she concludes that her parents no longer love her. What she doesn't yet know is that the parents are also grieving in their own way. But that misunderstanding leads her into this solo mission to rescue her sister and leads her into the streets of Rio, into a found family and all kinds of adventures and misadventures in an effort to connect with her sister.
Thank you. Thank you, Juliet. Um, so the next question is for Rebecca. What was your inspiration for a story about a resurrected, beheaded Anne traipsing through a highly detailed and mostly historically accurate London set on revenge? I mean,
That's not something that everybody daydreams about. Um, yeah, so I knew the story of Anne Boleyn had always really bothered me. Like every time I would encounter her, I feel like she's often presented as this kind of like home-wrecking seductress who seduces Henry VIII away from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who is usually presented as this like goodly queen. And then who gets what she deserves when she's executed for adultery, incest, and treason. But as I mentioned, most historians today agree that all of those charges against Anne Boleyn were likely false. And it doesn't take very much research at all to find out that Anne Boleyn was actually like a very intelligent person, that she was a really outspoken advocate for religious reform. Like England splits with the Catholic Church during this time period because Henry VIII wants an annulment from Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn. But Anne Boleyn was actually a religious reformer and like a true believer in the Protestant Reformation. And so I just wanted to find a way to tell her story that would show this version of her that I was discovering as I was researching her in more detail. And I thought about more satisfying ends to her story. And I thought about options like, okay, I could rewrite this so she like escapes before her execution, or she could like marry someone else, or maybe I set it forward in time or something. And what I kept coming back to was that her execution is this kind of like crystallization of the extreme misogyny of the time period that I think kind of resonates forward in some ways to today. Like, because she's a smart, politically powerful woman who's married to another politician, she really gets vilified in the public eye. And I think that the way that she's treated and her execution kind of like really show that. And so I didn't want to take that out. I didn't want to defang the beast, so to speak. And I thought, okay, I'm going to start the novel after her execution. But what if like these great cephalophore stories where a saint or another figure is beheaded and then picks up their head and just keeps going. What if she could do that? Like, what if she could just pick her head up and keep going? And in this book, she sews her head back on, so I didn't have to deal with the narrative problem of having a character like holding their head for the entire time, which would, I think, be really difficult to write. Um, but that was what I thought. And I really wanted the novel to be as historically accurate as I could make it. Like I was going to be taking this really wild narrative leap in rewriting her execution and having her come back. But I wanted the other details of the world as much as I could to be accurate to the time period. So I did a lot of research to try to do that.
I think we could see the level of research in the as I'm reading. I feel like each even small section was like, oh, I didn't know about that. Oh, that's so fascinating. So you can tell.
Thank you.
And then, so this question is for Tolani and for Heather. So, double happiness and leave your mess at home are told in alternating perspectives, but still the third person. So, in double happiness, it's between two characters discovering each other and themselves, really. And in leave your mess at home, it's between the siblings. So, what are the benefits to alternating perspective that's still third person perspective? And we'll start with Heather.
Okay, so I tend to laugh when I describe double happiness as a later in life love story because May is 36, Alexandra is 42, and I'm in my 40s, and I don't necessarily feel like I'm later in life. But I don't see that many novels about people at that age, and I wanted to explore that time in your life. So for many people, your late 30s and your early 40s are an inflection point. You've spent years working toward the goals that you've had since your 20s and 30s. And whether or not you've achieved those goals, they may no longer be serving you. And this was the benefit of having both May and Alexandra's perspectives in Double Happiness. When the novel opens, May feels like she finally has it all in work, life, and love. Meanwhile, Alexandra is the complete opposite. He's rebuilding his life after failing to achieve his lifelong dream of being a tenured research professor. So even though we have May starting at a high and Alexandra starting at a low, they're both grappling with that same question at the heart of Double Happiness of what makes a happy life.
And then I think in my case, the multi-perspective novel is just more fun. I don't know how people do the single perspective for 300 to 400 pages. I admire it. It's a skill that I just don't have yet. But yeah, as I said, the Lunga siblings like really hijacked my brain. I'd originally intended only to tell like one perspective and it just didn't work. And it totally changed the trajectory of the story that I ended up writing. But I think it was to the benefit of the novel that we have today. I think that multi-perspective storytelling, especially when you're trying to tell the story of a family, it is really helpful because you get to explore the ways that memory is like reshaped and reconstituted over time by who we become as people. So it was interesting to explore like how different family members would remember things differently. And I think also maybe as a reflection of my collectivist ethos and this held belief that I have that truth is participatory, I think then when trying to answer this question of how people learn to love, it was helpful to have these different perspectives as a window into that inquiry.
Yes, thank you both of you. Yeah, I love when there's multiple perspectives, but it's also, especially when I was thinking about the siblings, to see a memory through different lenses, and then in a relationship to see how that dynamic plays out. Um, I'm going to continue with the perspective trajectory. So this next one is for Erin. For the majority of Underlake, we have two main alternating perspectives, Ada and May, who they're kind of their situation mirrors each other, not exactly, but similar to a lake, their isolation, their loneliness. But you also intersperse other characters within the story at different points. How did this structure develop? And how did these singular perspectives enhance our view? How did you decide who to include? Because not all the voices are included.
Yeah, it was, I think as Talani said earlier, it's always a little bit iterative. And it's interesting. I like that metaphor of Autumn and May kind of mirroring each other in a lot of ways. I almost didn't really think of it like that because, I think that's the funny thing about loneliness. There's so many ways to be lonely that I feel mine, you feel yours, and I feel isolated because yours isn't like mine. So I think I was more interested in a way in how these characters that are from really different backgrounds kind of find commonality or find each other across these great different distances. And so with May and Otto, it was about sort of putting them in rooms together and seeing how they interacted and how they reacted to each other, but also what they can learn from each other, being from just as much learning because they have similarities as learning because they have differences, and how that learning can complement and help each other grow. As far as the other characters, as Kristyn referenced, there are interspersed chapters from the perspective of different cottages that are under the lake, so all these different worlds. And I actually called these, when I was writing them, I called them the archipelago, because they're kind of this chain of islands that are scattered remnants of a volcanic range. They're connected beneath the water, and they carry pieces of each other, but they've developed their own ecosystems sort of out of necessity. And so I wanted to explore the different kinds of extremes that emerge when we build our own worlds, when we're left to create the narratives that suit us best, and when we're just trying to survive. So I thought about that town. What did that town had? It had a pharmacy, a hardware store, a bank, and I wanted to explore how each of these places might have developed over 30 years in isolation. So I went to those places and they told me their stories, and that's sort of how they came to be.
Thank you. Yeah, I found them so fascinating.
Thank you.
Like with the trajectory they took, the different um, cottages took. So the next question is for Juliet. In Liar's Dice, the perspective is Dolores's at the age of what I think is about 8, and then also around 12 and 13. And it goes back and forth through time and place. How did you decide to use this format for storytelling?
Well, the novel opens when Dolores is 12 and Mita's already gone. We don't know exactly what happened to her. We just get Dolores' 12-year-old version of accounts. And I thought it was really important that the readers understand sort of her life before Mita went away, to really get a feeling of the rural life and their twinship. So at first I wrote them as flashbacks, but because I'm writing from a present tense 12-year-old point of view, it felt like 12-year-olds are really in the present moment, and it didn't feel right. So I found out, I tried a second storyline, and I really used it to thread in Dolores's memory, and for us to really firsthand experience all that she has lost. And also I found that the storyline acts with memory in the way that trauma works, where it just kind of interrupts the story and takes over. So every so often, the present storyline gets interrupted by these moments of her past. And they're kind of disparate moments that are somewhat triggered and linked to what's happening in the present. So I really wanted to talk a little bit about the fragmentation of trauma and how she carries her twin with her. Always, like the past is always in the present for her. And her twin is sort of this secret that she's carrying that she doesn't know how to, who to share it with. So I think the double storyline really helped me lean into her limited reality also, because she doesn't understand the parents' point of view, but through the second storyline, it kind of tells a very different story. So there's some contradictions there. You hear Dolores go, "Oh, my parents they don't love me all they care about are parties," and she's telling her friends. And then you see this family really organizing around a disabled child. And it tells a different story and makes you kind of wonder about Dolores's limited point of view.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it was like each time you learned a little bit more, and then I almost
Right.
wanted to go back again. It almost
Mhm.
made you want to reread a part. Um, Thank you so much. So I just wanted to put out there's a lot in the chat happening, which I'm happy about. If anyone in the audience has any questions or comments that they'd like to put out, please feel free, and we can always come to those also. It doesn't just have to be mine, but as of now, I'm going to keep going and I'll keep checking that Q&A box. So the next question is for Tolani. Leave Your Mess at Home takes place in present-day Chicago. The Longe family are also Nigerian, and your book explores this diasporic duality and how does where they come from and their place in the family. I always think about like sibling order, impact each sibling. And what was it like to, and you talked about this a little bit earlier, but the research process, what did that look like for you?
I'm so glad you picked up on the birth order thing. And research, I did not really do any research. I guess I spent my early adulthood in Chicago and I'm second generation Nigerian. So I guess from those two things, I then triangulated and made a lot of stuff up. But um, I think you're right, though, that the diasporic duality is reflected here. And in the case of, the Lunge siblings, the extent to which they identify with their Yoruba culture of origin or Black American culture very much is actually reflective of their place in the family. So we have Ola, who's the oldest sibling, and he very much takes on the mantle of upward economic social mobility as a child of economic migrants. And he does that to, his credit. But the cost, of course, is that sense of cultural alienation because in the pursuit of wealth, he then ends up frequenting a lot of white spaces because that's just how America is. So he feels alienated from his parents' culture, but he also feels like not but he feels like he has really no access to or claim to Black culture itself in the US. And then we have Sola, who's the second daughter of the family, and she's the oldest child. And she's somewhat of a parentified child as well. And so in adulthood, we see her, or sorry, the eldest daughter. But in adulthood, we see her kind of reject a lot of the responsibility that came with that. And as a result, also reject her parents' culture. So there are different aspects of that culture, like deference to elders or conservative sexual mores that she just cannot stand. So it's really interesting writing her perspective. And then we have Angela, who's the third daughter, the third child, the second daughter of the family. And she is interesting because I think she's the most values misaligned with her parents, but she does what she's supposed to do. She very much plays the role of the peacemaker. So she goes to medical school. If you know anything about Nigerian immigrants, they love it when their children become doctors. She becomes a doctor, but she's like interested in social justice and health equity and like isn't actually that invested in becoming upwardly socially mobile. And then the fourth child we have is Karen, and she's actually much younger than her older siblings. So she, I think, feels really lonely and isolated as a result, and is constantly throughout the novel, like trying to figure out where she belongs. And it's interesting because in the academic space, then she begins to explore like aspects of her parents' culture that they themselves have left behind. So she's interested in Yoruba religion and she like daydreams about what it would be like to live in Nigeria one day, even though she's never been there. So it was really fun to write her as well. But yeah, I would say that I think I had more of an intuitive sense of who they were. And then over time, I kind of came to understand a bit more about birth order theory and things like that. And then I understood why I'd set up the novel in the way that I did.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And I love the just make it up because I mean, that's what you're writing, right? It's from your heart. So it the next question is for Rebecca and Juliet. So both the beheading game and Liar's Dice include many historical moments and events as told within the main events of the story, some via side characters. What was the research process like for you, and how did you decide what to include and where? And we'll start with Rebecca.
Thank you. Yeah, so as I said, I did a lot of research for this novel, down to like little details. Like I can remember that early in the novel, when Anne says her head back on, one of the first things she does is break into a tavern and steal a glass of ale because she's really thirsty. And I can remember having to look up, like, okay, well, what would the vessel that she put the ale in have been called then? Like those kinds of details down to that level. But I also did a lot of research into Anne Boleyn's life and read a lot of biographies about her and historical books about her by Tudor scholars who do this professionally, and listened to a lot of Tudor podcasts. Just to kind of immerse myself in the story. And then after I completed the first draft, I took a research trip to London to go and visit some of the places that are in the novel because I have not lived in the United Kingdom. And although I had been to London years ago, I was not at the time obsessed with Anne Boleyn and writing a novel about her. So I didn't take note of all these little details. And I visited like the Tower of London and Hampton Court Palace and the Clink Prison Museum, and Westminster Abbey and some other places that pop up in the novel. And I got to just sort of like see the little details that help to bring the world to life. Like for example, Hever Castle is Anne Boleyn's childhood home, and I did the tour of Hever Castle, and there's a room that they speculate was probably her room. And I noticed that when you're in that room, the sunlight reflects off the moat water up onto the ceiling. So you can see that reflection of water on the ceiling. And that was one of those little texturizing details that ended up in the novel to just kind of like get into the place. In terms of like what events to include, because the novel takes place right after this really famous trial and execution, a lot of the historical events are just sort of like swirling right around that big event. But I did also include, as I mentioned, there's a character named Alice who is sometimes a prostitute, sometimes not, who lives in the Fens. And she is Alice. She becomes Anne's friend, but they also have a little bit of a developing love affair that starts to happen. And she lives in the Fens, and I really wanted to include in the novel that the Fens, which were this really vibrant wetland in northern England, were drained in the decades following the time that the novel is set in. So, like in the mid 16th century, this gorgeous wetland was the British monarchy brought in the people that had drained the Netherlands, like and used a system of dikes and dams and whatnot and ditches to just drain this beautiful, gorgeous wetland. So I really wanted that. I really wanted to include the Fens, and I really wanted to give a foreshadowing that that was going to happen because Anne Boleyn would have been involved in some of those discussions as they were deciding to drain this wetland and use it for farmland for increased wealth for rich people.
Hmm.
Thanks so much, Juliet.
Well, my research was unusual because while everything that happens in the novel was invented, it is based on my own story. I am a triplet, actually, and grew up in Brazil, and had a twin with cerebral palsy. So the story is very close to me, but I have total amnesia of my life with my sister. I don't remember. It's like this blank space. So my novel, in a way, was written to fill in that blank space. I was imagining her and imagining what she might be like in the second storyline. My memory begins in the like in Rio. So those scenes, though nothing happened that happened to me, the Rio parts of the novel were easy for me to write because I grew up there. But the village parts were harder because I was kind of writing into the unknown. And, the research involved various trips back. I went back to the village where I grew up, and my memory did not kind of come tumbling back the way one sees in the movies. Everything looked familiar, but also unfamiliar. And in fact, it turned out I was standing in front of my own home, and I didn't recognize it. So the research was sort of more like a sort of excavation and an act of imagination, and like sort of looking for my past and my memory, and also inventing it. So that's fiction was sort of a natural place for me to land, I think. Of course, I read books about the dictatorship. I went back and interviewed people who had been tortured. There's a second storyline that I haven't talked about where Dolores finds this found family of a disparate group of people, some of whom are sex workers, one of whom is trans. And, the trans population in Brazil was really persecuted by the dictatorship. And when the Truth Commission came out in 2014, I really realized I wanted to put that into the character already existed, but I wanted to put some of that into this character. So that's I carry that in the story, and that's some of what Dolores has to confront as she sort of tries to get people to help her find her sister. And one of the people is the sex worker, Sophia, who gets tortured by the police. And Dolores, in her, you know, travels, kind of runs into a bookstore and finds out that poems can heal Sophia, and poems help her too. So it's a journey to literacy. And the research was just very much kind of personal trips. The details were already inside me, I think. I didn't have to fill in by outside trips. I kind of carried them inside of me.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Um, Erin, I'm also curious about your research process with Underlake, the deep sea diving, the underwater communities. Could you share what your research process looked like?
Yeah, sure. So I love snorkeling, but I am not a diver for various reasons. So I had to do a lot of research for the novel, but ultimately it was really, really important to me that everything in the novel is possible. And I hope I've achieved that. So I read about Jacques Cousteau's efforts with Conch Shelf, which was an underwater living effort, the Navy's work with Sea Lab, which was something similar, watched instructional videos. I learned about commercial diving and oil rig maintenance and studied the impacts of nitrogen narcosis and spent way too much time learning about breathing gases. But the diving related stuff was only part of the research. It was as May and Ada descend deeper into the lake, they're confronting the challenges of high pressure. But there's also this layer of that they're encountering people who are suffering from various degrees of lead poisoning because the lake was. There was a paint factory under it. And one of the reasons that the paint factory closed was the outlawing of lead in paint. So I had to learn a lot about like the impacts of lead poisoning, how lead mining works, how to rebuild batteries, a lot of range of things, a lot of which never went into the novel, including, I could go on, but the research, some of it happened at the beginning, but most of it happened while I was writing. And I think that was the right way to do it, although sometimes it was frustrating because I would sit down to write and all I would do is learn how to build batteries. But, in the end, I think it was the right approach.
Great, thank you. All useful.
Yeah.
Um, so the next one, the question is for Heather. May's insecurities and fear often threaten to sabotage her happiness. At the same time, Alexandra's struggles are remarkably similar. Similar issues, self-doubt, workaholism. How did you navigate writing a relationship where both parties are simultaneously seeking healing?
So thank you for that question. And without giving away too much, May and Alexandra are both struggling from the same problem, which is using work to define their value and their self-worth. And there's a real danger in that I wanted to explore in my novel, because all too often, work will break your heart. And since May and Alexandra are facing similar challenges, they see how the other person is struggling and they begin to help each other. And because their struggles mirror each other, they begin to help themselves in the process. And this is something that I was very deliberate about when I was writing. Throughout the novel, May and Alexandra lean on each other and they share advice, but neither is telling the other person what they should do. Instead, they give each other the time and space to make their own decisions and trust that they'll find their way on their own. Because at the end of the day, they're two adults with agency and they need to reach their own conclusions about what's important in life and what makes a happy life in order to get to the point where they're both ready for love.
Thank you. So we don't have a lot of time left. So this will be the final question. And I'm looking through my questions. So I think I'm going to end with this one. Titles. I'm always interested in how titles form and how they shape the story we read. Some of these titles had multiple meanings. So this question is, when did you decide on the title? Did it pop to your head early on? Did it come together much later? And how did these multiple meanings connect to the different parts of your stories? So this is for everyone. And this time we're going to start with Juliet. The
I had my title really early on. It just came to me. Liar's Dice is a poker game that's very common in especially rural Brazil, and it's all about bluffing and luck. And in fact, my dad used to play it. It's usually played by men, but in my novel, it kind of recurs, and Dolores ends up playing it too. Um, so a lot of my novel is about bluffing and luck. Dolores and Mita are identical, except one has cerebral palsy and one hasn't. And their whole trajectories in life differ because of chance. And so that's like the central dilemma in the novel. And then there's the parents bluff a lot. They lie about their background. The father, neither of them are educated, they're poor, but they pretend not to be. The mother hides that she's illiterate and pretends to give dinner parties and even reads books upside down. You know, there's lots of bluffing going on. And both parents, the biggest bluff of all is that they're hiding their grief. And the grief goes underground so well that even Dolores doesn't know that her parents are grieving. And then on a larger perspective, the country is bluffing. You know, there's the Brazilian miracle, there's music, there's all this joy. And yet it was the worst years of the military dictatorship. So that's part of the reality. And institutionalization itself is a way of hiding away disabled children as if they didn't exist. So the title to me came early and felt like it captured sort of the complex reality that Dolores is navigating as she struggles to find her sister.
Thank you. Next, Heather.
So, like Juliet, Double Happiness has been my title from the very beginning. Actually, it's been the title since my very first draft, which was 25 drafts ago. And it refers to the Chinese character for happiness, which is written twice to
Hmm.
celebrate love. And I love how the term double happiness speaks to my Chinese heritage while also alluding to all the doubles in my book. May's two love interests, the elusive balance between work and life, two sisters with two brothers, and two very different futures for May and Alexandra.
Thank you so much, Rebecca.
So I really struggle with titling, and for me, this title came very late in the process. And actually, my agent suggested the beheading game, and I really loved it. So, the beheading game is a reference to the story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a story from Arthurian legend. The Green Knight is this mythical figure who shows up at the court of King Arthur and says, "Anybody who wants to can try to behead me, and if you do, you get to keep my cool axe, but I get to return to you the blow a year later." And Gawain, who's very young and like cocky, gets up to do it, beheads the Green Knight, thinks, well, problem solved. Now he's dead. He can't come back after me. But the Green Knight picks up his head, walks away. And then a year later, Gawain has to show up for his own beheading. And because he's valiant and does show up, the Green Knight just gives him a little nick on the back of the neck and lets him go his own way. But I love the idea of linking the story of Anne Boleyn, in which that I've recreated, in which she is the cephalophore figure, to this really classic beheading game story, which was a story trope in the British Isles. During this time period. And I also like, there was a point later in the novel that had already been written in, where she's like looking at a tapestry of the story of Gawain and the Green Knight and thinking about it, and where she thinks about how it's a beheading game. And I liked how this is a story on an accelerated timeline. Like, she takes place over 10 days, because in real life, Henry VIII remarries 11 days after her execution. So I liked how it gave the novel a feel of like, she is on a timeline and she is in a game of her own, trying to accomplish this really gruesome but vengeful task.
Thank you, Tolani.
Yeah, my title was hard one. I think like Rebecca, I struggle with titles. This was maybe the third one that my manuscript had, and it came at the like final hour, when it was time to kind of usher my novel forth into the world. But I do think it has multiple meanings. I think first and foremost, it speaks to um, the pressure to assimilate, and maybe also the pejorative attitude that receiving countries can have towards the customs of immigrants. And you see this in the novel in the second generation, reflected in, I think, the sense of alienation as well as the sense of longing that they all have. Um, I think that Leave Your Mess at Home also speaks to the pressure to feel like you have it all together and, to seem like you're successful. And each of the siblings are reflecting this in their own way. So it can be like through a curated online self or through a very, lucrative career or having the right kind of education. And then lastly, I think that it's also a nod to this idea that if you leave your mess at home, you'll eventually come home to find the mess. So I think it reflects, the process of this family kind of unearthing what's at the core of all of its dysfunction.
Thank you. Erin?
Yeah, so like Talani, I'll say that my title for Underlake was really, really hard. What's funny is I think it's just either really easy or hard. So the title for my next novel, I already know it. I knew it from the start. With poems, they often just come to me. But this one, Underlake ultimately is a core neologism of the book. It's a name that May uses for the underwater world that she came from. So I think it just adequately captures the strangeness and the kind of mystery that I hope pervade the novel. And it made sense.
Thank you. And I really want to give just a very heartfelt thank you to everyone. It was wonderful reading your books, and it was wonderful getting to chat with you and for such an engaging discussion. I want to thank all the librarians, educators, everyone who came and listened and wrote in the chat. Next up, there are two concurrent panels, book club picks and the heart of the story, middle grade author shaping conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.